the beginning of session 2, the first part, I'm going to speak about how the new media relates to the individual operations of the soul of the sister in union with the body. This is a philosophical topic. You may remember that I mentioned before that the pastoral instruction following the Second Vatican Council said to us that we really had to have a full and proper understanding of man in order to understand how to integrate the new media. So what I want to do, I'll draw upon the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and I can give the actual numbers in the Catechism that refer to these sections for those of you that want to follow up in that. The Catholic Church really speaks about, first of all, how every individual human being is created as a unity and soul and body. This is in paragraph 364. Man, though made of body and soul, is a unity. Through his very bodily condition, he sums up in himself the elements of the material world. Through him, they're brought to their highest perfection and can raise their voice in praise freely given to the Creator. Now, they're quoting in the Catechism from Gaudium et Spes. So we have several principles here. The first is that we are a union of body and soul, and that we have an obligation to perfect those aspects of this union that are given to us by virtue of our being a human being. And in our case, we're women religious, so that's within the range of the human being. There are really three phases of this movement towards perfection. The first is what I would call the development of the capacity. When we're a fetus, growing in our mother's womb, our brainstem, all the operations of the soul that give us life, that make it possible for us to grow, digest, move, all of these operations, the capacities are being developed. And in early childhood, as you know, you're born, you start to breathe, you look around, you hear, you walk, talk. So these are the early phases of just developing the capacities of using the operations of our soul in relation to the material body that we've been given, that it organizes, that it dynamizes, you can say. Secondly, as we grow from childhood through youth, we begin to work on perfecting the capacities. We become an athlete. We learn how to use our body well. We learn to give speeches. All of these kind of things. Learn about music, art, anything that is a particular gift of ours, perhaps. We go to school, reading, writing. So in that second phase, it's not just the getting our body structured in such a way that we have a capacity, it's actually exercising the operation of our capacity. And it's our soul that does this. And then the third phase, the church would argue, just as we saw in this example above, is that we're really called to perfection in our human identity. Now that doesn't just mean being a perfect runner or skier or writer. It could be that, if that's part of our vocation. But it means to come to a perfection as a human being in our unity. And this is a beautiful passage from a text called Gravissimum Educationes that says the following: the church is bound as a mother to give these children of hers an education by which their whole life can be imbued with the Spirit of Christ, and at the same time do all she can to promote for all peoples the complete perfection of the human person, the good of earthly society, and the building of a world that is more human. So even though we're born with this unity, metaphysically speaking, of soul-body, we have to exercise our will, our intellect, our good judgment, our conscience, all of these things, in order to experientially, we would say in philosophy, or existentially is another way we say it, grow towards a higher level of perfection, of love for our Lord, of service in our vocation. At continuously deeper levels of our being. And this is a passage from the Pontifical Council of Social Communications related to this. As matters stand, this is 1992, mass media exacerbate individual and social problems which stand in the way of integral development of the human person. In other words, sometimes it gets in the way. And so really what we want to look at then is how does it do this? In order to look at how it gets in the way, I want to lay out for you the structure of the human being and the various aspects that we have that the media particularly relate to. So the lower operations of the soul, we call the soul the form of the body in its lower operations. We have one human soul. When it's operating in the body, it's organizing, we would say, below, if you want to put it spatially. When it's praying, when we are praying, we're operating with the higher operations of our soul, which is called spirit. We're praying spirit to spirit. And so it's the same human soul that has these two incredible aspects of its identity. It's the only human beings, only human souls have those two. So first I'm going to start with the lower operations. We'll go through all of them and talk about how they are to be understood. So in the soul operating as the form of the body, the first thing it does is it gives our body life. It moves the life. So once the soul has life, when you're in your mother's womb as an embryo, you start to digest. You take in nutrition, digesting in a big sense. You're taking in nutrition, you're growing. And eventually, after 2 or 3, 4 months, you're starting to move around. So the soul is exercising locomotion. There have been some studies that show that the child, before it's born, can see light, can respond to light, hear noise, things like that. So the lower operations of the senses we know there's evidence for their happening. What are the 5 external senses that the normal human being has? Sight, hearing, smelling, touching, and tasting. Now, when we talk about media, sight and hearing are usually considered to be the most important. We have wonderful statements by the Church about how these senses can become perfected. For example, sensing beauty through the eyes or ears can lead a sister to greater love of God by what we call prudent sense elevation. Starting from the world's order and beauty, one can come to a knowledge of God as the origin and end of the universe, paragraph 32 in the Catechism. Pope Benedict does a lot of writing about what we call the 4 transcendentals: beauty, good, truth, and unity. These are all things that God has in perfection, and that everything that is shares to some less degree. So we can say the transcendental implies God is beautiful. So if we're able to, even in our external senses, we look at beauty in the chapel, for example, those wonderful icons, it elevates our senses to think of God. Pope John Paul II emphasizes the communal aspects of our senses, external senses. In the World Communications Day message of 1992, he says, "On this day, we celebrate the blessings of speech, of hearing, and of sight, which enable us to emerge from our isolation and loneliness in order to exchange with those around us the thoughts and sentiments which arise in our hearts," unquote. He also notices, however, that our senses of sight and hearing can become a source of harm to us. Just 5 years after he wrote that, in 1997, he wrote the following: "The fact is that it is increasingly difficult to protect one's eyes and ears from images and sounds which arrive through the media unexpectedly and uninvited. Public opinion has been shocked at how easily the advanced communication technologies can be exploited by those whose intentions are evil," unquote. So again, we have this great gift of these senses that are given to us to elevate us to union with God, at the same time as have been used and are continuing to be used for evil purposes. The second area of the senses are called internal senses. Therefore, these are St. Thomas's categories, basically, St. Thomas Aquinas. The 4 of them are called memory, imagination, common sense, and estimative sense. The common sense is when we use 2 different sights around the same thing. So right now I can look at that microphone and I can tap it and it makes a noise, but I know that it's the same thing. I'm bringing two senses together. That's the common sense. It's not intuition. The other thing, the estimative sense, is the interior capacity for you to, having made one set of experiences, to draw a conclusion to estimate another. So when you learn to drive a car, you don't have a very good estimative sense. You kind of go too wide around the corners, things like that. Over time, you do. You begin to by your memory and so on, to make better judgments. Now, these are great senses that we have. And we know that when a sister enters religious life, she brings with her images and memories that she's received from her external senses and is stored in her internal senses. John Paul II describes this phenomenon this way: like soft wax on which every tiniest pressure leaves a mark, so the child is responsive to every stimulus that plays upon his imagination, his emotions, his instincts and ideas. Yet the impression received at this age are the ones which are destined to penetrate most deeply into the psychology of the human being and to condition, often in a lasting way, the successive relationship with himself and others and with his environment. Unquote. This is the 13th World Communications Day, 1979. Now again, we were talking earlier about religious sisters when they enter the community, if they've had a lot of experience with electronic media, even unfortunately things that may not have been so good for them to see, those images are still there, those experiences are stored. And so it's a very difficult thing for them to become purified. But it's not impossible most times, but it's very difficult, and it takes formation. So the theological virtue of hope is often described in the Catechism as the one that perfects the memory. It's paragraph 1817 and 1818. This is borrowing from St. Augustine's notion of how the faith perfects the intellect, hope perfects the memory, and charity perfects the will. So these faculties we have are perfected by the three great theological virtues in those ways. The next category are called the human passions. These are very important. There are the motors that move us. St. Thomas Aquinas identifies 11 of them. 6 are what we call concupiscible passions. They move us towards a good, a perceived good, or away from an evil, a perceived evil. They are called pleasure and pain, desire, hope, and love and hate. These are just normal passions, not vices or virtues yet. And then there are 5 irascible passions, which, if we meet an obstacle where we're trying to get a good that we want or away from an evil we want to avoid, the irascible passions kick in and help us either overcome the obstacle or give up. So the irascible ones are fear and daring, hope and despair, natural hope, not the virtue of hope, and anger. Okay, so they're all great gifts of just our basic nature. So the term passions, according to the Catechism, belong to the Christian patrimony. They're feelings or emotions or movements of the sensitive appetite that incline us to act or not to act in regard to something felt or imagined to be good or evil. They're a natural component of the human psyche. They form the passageway and ensure the connection between the life of the senses and the life of the mind. And this is the Catechism, paragraphs 1763 and 1764. Now, the media can inspire noble passions. And when the content is uplifting, it does this. But it can have the opposite effect. And this is Pope John Paul II in 15th World Day Communications in 1981. He says, "My personal experience and convictions about humanity, about Christianity, all lead me to emphasize the possibilities for good, the richness and the timeliness of the media. I can add that the part of the media work which is labeled artistic does not escape me, but exalts me." A great actor that he was in theater and poetry. But all this, he continues, cannot hide the fact that in their use or abuse, there are those who have the profit, the industry, the means of power. Among these, there is the possibility to extol violence through the description and representation of that already appearing in daily newspapers, along with consenting words and pictures, which perhaps even pretend to be condemning it. Too often it is something like a search, tending to excite violent emotions to stimulate the attention, which is often slack, unquote. So it's a pretty hard words at the same time as he just loves the beauty that can come from it. So now we get to the highest operations of the soul. The first is the intellect, and the second is the will. Since the human soul is created directly by God as spirit, these faculties of intellect and will are called spiritual faculties. And they're not dependent totally on the body for their operation. This is why after we die, we hope our intellect, our will, it carries us forward into higher spiritual realities. So the church teaches that every spiritual soul is created immediately by God in paragraph 166. So when the human soul begins to operate as spirit, it is turning upward towards spiritual realities. Spirit signifies that from creation man is ordered to a supernatural end, and that his soul can gratuitously be raised beyond all it deserves to communion with God. Paragraph 367 in the Catechism. Endowed with a spiritual soul, with intellect and free will, the human person is from his very conception ordered to God and destined for eternal beatitude. He pursues his perfection in seeking and loving what is true and good. Paragraph 1711. So our intellect has two operations. One is called theoretical and the other practical. Just one intellect, but it can do both things. The theoretical intellect searches for truth like radar, but it can only receive the truth according to the mind of the receiver. So there's the great truth out there, but this is why education is so important, because it enlarges the mind, greater truth can be received. The theological virtue of faith perfects the intellect. In 1814, John Paul II again discusses the dual nature of the media in relation to truth. On the one hand, the media, can blur the distinction between truth and illusion, but on the other, it can open up unprecedented opportunities for making the truth more widely accessible to many more people. The task of the church is to ensure that it is the latter which actually happens. That's the 35th World Communications Day, 2001. Our practical intellect applies truth to particular acts, like cooking, praying, serving. In the moral range, our conscience is an act of our practical intellect. Through it engages those aspects of media which we receive passively through the senses. And here's a quotation from the Catechism about the conscience. Conscience is a judgment of reason whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act that he's going to perform, is in the process of performing, or has already completed. Paragraph 1778. You're on the email working away, and all of a sudden you think, I've wasted 45 minutes. Time that God gave me and I've really just done nothing much but delete emails. Now, mind you, we have to do some of these things, but that's in the midst of the act. Our conscience also operates when we're thinking about doing something, making a choice, or when we're preparing for confession. We go back over what we've done, we look at it. Now, it's like a motion sensor light. If I said to you right now, find your conscience, you wouldn't be able to do it. You'd just stare at me. Because you're not thinking about the moral quality of an act that you've done, are doing, or are going to do. One of the biggest problems today is that young people, old people, don't know how to locate their conscience. They think it's their passions. They think it's their will. They think it's their imagination. If they're Freudian, they think it's their memory. You have all these wrong ways of understanding what the conscience is, but it's a judgment of the practical intellect. So we have this incredible gift which can help us come to our true end. The church documents puts a lot of emphasis on the human conscience in relation to the media. And here's one such example. Parents have a serious duty to help their children learn how to evaluate and use the media by forming their consciences correctly and developing their critical faculties. According to their age and circumstances, children and young people should be open to formation regarding the media, resisting the easy path of uncritical passivity, peer pressure, and commercial exploitation, unquote. That's from Ethics in Communication. Finally, the last part I just want to talk about briefly is the will. The will chooses the good. It goes out of the self and chooses the apparent good. So your will is not limited the way the intellect is of only receiving according to the mode of the receiver. If you pray with your will or you do an act of charity, you could go out and rest in God, even though our little will is tiny. Okay, that's an amazing thing about it. So the theological virtue of charity perfects the will, and God is the true good. So in beatitude, we hope one day to rest in God totally. The intellect, though, presents to the will the good choices that it should make. All right, so the will needs to have something directing it. It's blind by itself. So this is where we have to come to understand, when we look interiorly at ourselves, what's happening. Carol Wojtyła in The Acting Person has a beautiful way of describing it. If you think about an act you want to do, let's say you want to watch something in the media or use media at a certain time, you have this experience of I may do it, I have a computer, I have the time, on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have this experience, I need not. I don't have to do this. I could do something else. Then you have your passions rising up. Ooh, I'm sick of work. I just want a break. Okay? I desire, I want. But there you are between, I may do this, I don't have to do it, I feel this desire to, or different things. That's where you experience your arena of freedom. You are free, and you make the choice. So what he's saying is we have a real experience of our freedom. It's the dynamism proper to the will in those concrete events. So then I have to choose. So he says, I choose become the moment, actually this is my saying here, not his. I choose becomes the moment of acting that faces every sister in her apostolate and community life in relation to her use of various medias, radio, television, newspapers, computer, internet, email, cell phone, etc. The Pontifical Council of Social Communications puts it succinctly, quote, in short, the media can be used for good or evil. It's a matter of choice, unquote. To conclude this, I just want to have a little passage that I put on your little sheet that Sister Timothy Prokes, who's a member of the Franciscan Sisters of the Eucharist, used to head a beautiful article she wrote on the media. And she says, here's the situation we're in today. It's a time of immense contrast. In St. Peter's Square, 100,000 waited for a wisp of smoke over the Sistine. Yet in many hands were cell phones, readied for immediate transmission of the ancient sign, unquote. Thank you.